Hey everybody, welcome back to another one. This time we're going to be covering the sort of age of classics leading to the development of the major early Chinese empires and dynasties, the Qin and the Han. As we're going to see, the Qin and the Han are kind of paired together. The Qin is only around for a really brief period, but then the Han goes on to be quite expansive. So last time when we left off, we were talking about the Xia and the Shang, these early dynasties or empires. It's sort of problematic, right? As we saw in the readings, these early sort of Chinese complex societies, and they're often paired in three with the Xia, the Shang, and then the Zhou. But I wanted to leave the Zhou till this time. For one, the lecture last time was obviously getting too long, as this one will be as well. But also, it goes a little bit better to sort of flow into the classical era and sort of show where that's coming from now that you've started reading some of the Confucian texts. He's going to be talking a lot about the Zhou, so you'll get a sense of that going on. So this is going to be kind of a weird time. Everything's going to come in together and fuse into something new. Remember when we looked at the Shang, they did these sorts of burials that we hadn't seen before. Stuff like that's going to go away, but the other aspects, the bronzes, are going to stick around, things like that. And this time period that's going to evolve, the Zhou, the Qin, Han, are often seen as the sort of ancient classical Chinese antiquity period, in the same way that a lot of Western thinkers think of Greece and Rome as the sort of foundations for European society or something like that, even though, again, that's a really tricky, maybe not necessarily true. The same is true in East Asia as well. So this will really set the tone and the sort of textures for future Chinese dynasties, and we'll get a sense of how that works. So first we'll look at the so-called Age of Classics, primarily focusing on the Zhou. Then we'll look at the Qin Empire and the Han Dynasty and how that sort of evolved. So during the Age of Classics, which really starts with the Zhou, these really long-standing cultural practices are developed that come to be the sort of center of East Asian thought and governmental practices. When these people were doing it, they didn't know this was the future. The Zhou themselves were sort of new on the scene and establishing an empire or dynasty that worked for them. But um, later Chinese people are going to reflect on this time and say, this was the best of the best. And so it develops into a sort of mystique about when China was sort of perfect. So we'll see kind of more of that here. Let me adjust that a little. There you go. Okay, so remember I've shown you this before. You have the first so-called three kingdoms, right? The Xia, the Xiang, and the Zhou. And you can see a sort of expanding territory each time centered around the Yellow River. So we talked about the Xia, we talked about the Shang. The Xia, right, maybe mythical, maybe not. Certainly there was some sort of bronze culture that had this sort of wider influence. The Shang, yeah, we kind of know about them an awful lot. But remember, the Shang, right when we ended last time, I hinted that there were some people further up the river that didn't like them. Those people are the Zhou. Opposition to the Shang grew upriver in large part because as the Shang were expanding, they wanted more taxes, they wanted more soldiers. They were seen as sort of too expansive and too greedy by people at the fringe of the empire, at the sort of hinterlands. So one of those peoples was the Zhou. So the Zhou dynasty is going to start proper in 1045 BCE, but they've been around before that. They were a relatively small group on the fringe of Shang society, and they were not considered civilized people. The Chinese have a bunch of different words for this. They weren't quite Yi, they weren't barbarians, but they weren't, learned, practiced, ritual people either. So they're one of these groups that's getting tired of the Shang. They see them as too expansive, too greedy, so they rebel. But the Zhou had recently developed something that gave them a huge advantage over the Shang in a way that nobody really saw coming. the Zhou had developed iron, and it's a sort of debate where this came from. Probably this is because the Zhou were a little bit further to the west and had a little bit more connection with Central Asia. So they were kind of a little bit more tapped in to trade routes where iron might have been coming from. They may have developed the process on their own, or it might have been a sort of more regional process, but it probably came through Central Asia. In any event, iron is ubiquitous, and it is much cheaper and easier to make than bronze. So the Shang did use bronze for weapons, but iron, as it turns out, is much stronger. So if someone has an iron sword and they hit you with your bronze armor, chances are you're going to end up dead. So the Zhou forces had a lot of benefits coming into this during this sort of rebellion or this uprising. They were able to really stick it to the Shang. One person in particular, his name was King Wu, was going to form this larger dynasty over about 50 years or so. Him and his family are going to lay the groundwork for what becomes the Zhou dynasty. And here you can see it like at its absolute peak, expanding in between the Yellow River and the Yangtze River. So this is the first time you get a sort of unified section of China. Before, when we looked at those first three kingdoms, they're all centered around the Yellow River. When we looked at the Yangtze or Yangtze River earlier on, the Neolithic communities that developed there had formed kingdoms, but they weren't part of this sort of classical Chinese world, at least not in the way we think of them now. So the Zhou dynasty is really going to connect all this stuff. It's going to connect this sort of central area that we now think of as like the heartland of China, the country or the nation state. In particular, here you go, here's King Wu. Wu, by the way, just means marshal. So he's the martial king, which I guess is a good name to give yourself if you're leading an uprising or something like that. His forces destroy the last Shang soldiers, and he declares himself the new legitimate ruler of all of the Shang's former lands, plus he's on a roll. He's going to start taking over some neighboring regions. That's why the Zhou dynasty is bigger. And he is going to instigate new policies that are a little bit different than the Shang. Instead of ruling over everybody directly, where you have to actually ride around and like check up on people, he's going to rule through indirect rule, meaning he gets relatives or powerful allies and he puts them out in local seats of power, and then they do the ruling locally and then report to him. Do I have a map of that? Yeah, okay, here you go. So I put this in here. These are all the different principalities during the Zhou dynasty. So all of these little areas are sort of nominally independent. This is not super unified. They have different currencies, language, cultures in many ways, but they all kind of report. You can see Zhou is lit up there in red in the middle. They all kind of report back to the Zhou king. So it's a sort of dispersed rule. It's not super direct in the way we sometimes think of old Mesopotamian kings or something riding around and actually checking up on everybody or something. It's not like that. So this is really good. It comes with a lot of benefits, but it might also set up some future problems. And since the Zhou were formerly not quite Chinese, maybe, they had to come up with some sort of way to rule all of these new people they were subjugating. So empires are often defined by a strong sort of central leadership that is somehow separate from the actual people it rules. By definition, everybody in the empire is not the same, right? If everybody in the state is the same, that's a nation state, and those aren't going to come around for thousands of years. So all of these different people had to have some sort of way to bind them together. And actually, Emperor Wu is not going to be able to do that. His helper is. His helper, as it turns out, is the Duke of Zhou. So if you've been reading the Confucius stuff, You've probably heard a little bit about this guy, this Duke of Zhou. Here he is. He's the youngest brother of King Wu, and he helps Wu establish the dynasty when he first comes to power. When King Wu dies, the Duke of Zhou is going to take power for himself through a regency. So there's a nice new young, king or emperor coming up, but he's not in power yet. Actually, the regent will rule over him. It's a real kind of Game of Thrones thing if you're hip to that. Also, the Duke of Zhou does something that in the future will be seen as very bad, but at the time, hey, you gotta do what you gotta do. He fights his other brothers to be in this position. His other brothers want to be regent and want to sort of have more direct control over the kingdom, and he doesn't let them do that. So the Duke of Zhou spends his time trying to sort of come up with an ideological reason, a sort of a combination, right, of like propaganda and official sort of state explanation for how government works, how the Shang lost their kingdom, and how the Zhou are legitimate leaders. And he comes up with this interesting idea, the mandate of heaven, and it's going to become central to Chinese thinking and to a lesser extent Korean and Japanese thinking pretty much right up until today, although in a sort of different guise from the 20th century on. When the Duke of Zhou dies in 1033, he's left behind this huge legacy for how sort of future Chinese leaders have to behave. And all of a sudden, they have to pay attention to this new idea that's become very popular within elite circles, the mandate of heaven. So what is the mandate of heaven? It's tricky because, remember, we talked about this a little bit last time, heaven in Chinese and East Asian thinking has nothing to do with Christianity, Abrahamic religions, heaven or hell, afterlife. It's none of that. That's just the word that European translators chose, right? Okay, so what does it mean? It's like a cosmic power or a universal energy or the sort of like moral fabric of the universe. So the universe has some sort of overriding will and moral direction. And if you want to be a good leader, you better be in step with that. So some people have tried to connect this to different inter-Asian sky gods. The Mongolians and people who are originally from basically what today is like Central and Eastern Russia had very early on sort of shamanic practices that worshipped a universal sort of sky god. And from the Chinese characters, there might be some sort of connection there. But it's not really known how this idea developed so specifically in China and not necessarily in other places. Right? Monotheistic gods aren't around for a while in the Mediterranean world in the same way. And this isn't even a monotheistic god, right? It's more of a oneism sort of thing, which will give you something fun to look up. Anyway, so once the Duke of Zhou comes out with this idea, here's his idea. There is a sort of natural moral leadership in the universe. The heavens are in accord with what is right and what is good, and they somehow control sort of the fabric of all the cosmic power and energy. So the way rulers come into power is they tap into this cosmic energy. And for whatever reason, heaven bestows its favor on you. And all of a sudden, this connection to cosmic power and the sort of will of the universe allows you to become the new leader. Sounds pretty good. But that means that when things go wrong, you might be to blame. For example, if there start to be a bunch of earthquakes, or a tsunami, or bad crop harvests, or fires, or something, this might be heaven telling the people that the ruler is no longer in favor with the universe. So theoretically, this then allows for rulers to be overthrown. Here's a sort of cyclical chart. I know the words are probably pretty small, depending on where you're watching this, but it sort of describes this mandate of heaven idea. Basically, it's a circular pattern. A new dynasty is born, and there's a new emperor or a new king, a new government that fixes the problems of the past and comes to power to make the empire run smoothly. Then everything's working for a bit and the people are happy. But sooner or later, the government becomes corrupt. I used to have an old politics teacher way back that said basically there's three things that get you in trouble. It's the money, it's the power, and it's the sex. And if you can't control those three things, right, you're in big trouble. So if you're getting greedy in one way or another, it's going to catch up with you. And all the governments become corrupt eventually. When the government becomes corrupt, bad things start to happen in nature. There's droughts, there's famine, there might be a volcanic eruption, all kinds of stuff like this. There might also be restless peasants. Now these things go together, right? If there's a drought and the peasants can't get enough food to eat, they're going to rebel or they're going to be restless. They're not going to want to pay taxes. These are kind of going together. So once a lot of this stuff starts happening, the dynasty is considered to have lost the mandate of heaven. The sort of will of the cosmos is no longer with the ruler. When that happens, there might be some person or some group of people that are strong enough to stand up and defeat the king or the emperor or his forces. And when they do, the only reason they could have done that is because they have now gained this mandate from heaven to lead. So they're now the new legitimate rulers. And this idea reinforces that sort of cyclical nature of Chinese dynasties that in a sort of historiographical way really lend itself to just being like, oh, this dynasty, this dynasty, this dynasty, right, through time. It's always more complicated than this. Also, as we know now, bad things just happen. Sometimes there's just a tsunami. It has nothing to do with leadership. And even though this system would seem to imply that it's okay to rebel, it certainly was not, and could easily get you killed. It's not like the people themselves had any consciousness as a class or something like that. That's just like infinitely far away. So there is this idea that the government can be legitimately overthrown. Well, why would you make an idea like this if you're the Zhou? Well, you might propagate it because you overthrew the Shang. So you could sort of rewrite a history. And you could say the Shang had grown decadent and corrupt, and oh, there was that earthquake, and oh, the peasants didn't have enough food. So we rose up and we took them out, and now we, the Zhou, are legitimate because of this process. And as long as things go good, you can be assured that we, have this mandate of heaven. You are, of course, opening yourself up to perhaps later not having the mandate of heaven, but hopefully that's really far down the road. As it turns out, it wasn't tremendously far down the road. So in 771, the unthinkable happens to the Zhou. Their capital at Hao was sacked by steppe nomads. So remember we talked about those people who had given up farming and had taken up the horse. In this map you can kind of see the steppes just like ominously labeled in the north there above the Yellow River. And if you look straight down from the word steppes, you see the small area that's the central area of Zhou, and the city is labeled as Chengzhou, but don't worry about that. It's got a different name as well. A lot of times with these maps, it's hard to find. There'll be multiple names and stuff like that. Anywho, when the steppe nomads come riding in and invade the Zhou, this is seen as sort of shattering that idea that the Zhou have like the mandate of heaven and the empire was thriving and doing really well and they had competent leadership and all that sort of thing. The leadership survives, but they have to relocate their capital to a city that becomes Luoyang in the future. You'll hear that again, that's going to become a main city later Also, if you're a tourist and you go to China, it's a great place to go and visit. This is near where the terracotta warriors are, and there's some beautiful caves there and all sort of stuff. Anyway, when they move the capital, this becomes known as the era of the Eastern Zhou, because they had to move their capital kind of east. But the Eastern Zhou, as it turns out, is more complicated. It gets divided up into other periods. I kind of laid them out here for you: the Spring and Autumn period, and then the Warring States period. So the Zhou dynasty, uh, one way of thinking of it is, oh, it goes on for like 800 years, wow, or a really long time. But you can also see these sort of subdivisions within that category, and you can kind of start to wonder, well, was it really the same, or is that just easy for categorical purposes and stuff like this? So the first half of the Eastern Zhou period, the Spring and Autumn period, has a really unique character. Basically, in the Spring and Autumn period, all of these aristocrats and elites and even people in the military and stuff thought, what happened? The Zhou had the mandate of heaven. By now, that's become a totally internalized concept amongst the elites. We were in the right, we were doing the right thing, we were spiritually and cosmically in line with the universe. Yet, those nasty, horse riders came in and destroyed our city. We had to relocate and stuff. So, what did we do wrong? And this spurs a series of sort of artistic and intellectual movements from philosophers and thinkers trying to figure out, okay, so we know about the mandate of heaven. How do we get it back? What do we do? What is good governance look like? And how are we going to continue the dynasty moving forward in a way that's going to make us strongest and prevent this from happening again? During this period, you get the 100 schools of thought. People are just coming out of the woodwork with all kinds of different ideas about good governance, strong militaries, what society should look like, how to prevent outsiders from destroying you, how to keep the peasants, fed, all kinds of stuff, right, left and right, about what you need to do as a leader or as the sort of intellectual class to ensure society's function. The main one that's going to become the most popular, arguably, is Confucianism. You've already started reading about that a little bit, but there's a bunch more: Taoism, Moism, legalism, 100 schools of thought, right? So I'm going to introduce a few of them that'll be the main ones that we actually kind of see again, and spend some time talking about the main sort of characteristics of them. Yeah, okay, there's an image of Tao. We'll get to that. Okay, so the first one you might be interested in is Confucius. So hopefully you've started doing some of that reading. I know some people in the discussion had said they found it pretty tricky, kind of difficult, kind of hard to read. The version that we have is really good in that the author not only writes the Analects in translation, but she also talks a lot about how they've been translated and how they've been thought about by other Chinese people. Because Confucianism starts becoming a thing maybe around 450, BCE. So it's been around for 2,500 years. Lots of other Chinese folks have interpreted these sayings and these ideas differently. So the author is trying to sort of highlight some of that for us. Anyway, Confucius was not his real name. That's a Western take on it. His real name in Chinese is Kong Fuji, which just means Master Kong. So his name was Kong, and he was a master. Anyway, when Europeans heard that, they couldn't make any sense of it. Slowly it sort of turned into Confucius in the sort of European dialects. Anyway, he was an aristocratic guy, but not of any particular money, not of any particular high title, but he was part of the literate class, part of the elite. And he was part of these 100 schools of thought in the Eastern Zhou, looking for a sort of resolution to what had happened. The Zhou were so great, they had the mandate of heaven, and yet horse riders from outside came and destroyed society and threatened the sort of end of the world in a sense. So what could be done different? How should we change our thinking? Well, the first thing that he sort of claimed was all government power stems from the moral righteousness of the leader. If the leader of society is pure and moral and righteous and upright, then society will be too. If the leadership is greedy or um, corrupt or lies, these sorts of things is dishonest, then society will reflect that as well. So this was his main sort of thinking. He espoused this idea. Of course, he was immediately fired from his job as an advisor working for the state of Lu, because it's very dangerous to tell politicians, oh, hey, anything bad that happens is your fault. And if only you were more moral and upright and thoughtful, society would have been better, or this bad thing wouldn't have happened, or something like that. So he gets fired as an advisor. He's not political enough. He's not good enough at sort of playing the game and being a yes man or these sorts of things. So he does something that was reasonably popular at the time for a government official. He hits the road, and he sort of, for a little more than a decade, wanders around and teaches. And anyone who will hire him, he will work for. So this includes being a judge. This includes being a bureaucrat. He works for different states. So he works for different local governments. Remember, the Zhou didn't have one centralized government. They had all of these different provinces, right, that were nominally under their own control, that then reported to the Zhou sort of central command, as it were. So he goes to these different states and offers his services, working for them. And as he's kind of rolling, he collects a group of followers that really appreciate his style, his take on government, his teachings. Then when he's like 70 years old, he's become a sort of famous master, and he's invited back to the state of Lu to continue to work for the government there. But he basically gets home and dies shortly after, having spent most of his sort of prime of his intellectual and philosophical life traveling and teaching. So what sort of stuff did he teach, or what is he famous for? So basically, it's a conservative philosophy. And this doesn't have anything to do with modern American conservatism or Republicans or anything like that. What it means, and what it used to mean in the American context as well, was he said, look, the greatness was in the past. The original Zhou dynasty did something amazing. They created this unified state, and that's when the rulers had the mandate of heaven, and that's when everything was great. So how do we get back to that earlier time, right? So Confucianism has this really conservative bend, this traditionalist bend, that the past was where it was at. We need to take actions now to get back to that great time, right? So how do you do that? Well, we could study some books from the past and get a sense of their thinking and their moral philosophy, and we could incorporate that into our own lives. So he picks these 5 books that are the classics from early Zhou times, because the Zhou dynasty has been around now for hundreds of years. And he picks these books: the Book of Changes, Songs, Rites, Documents, Spring and Autumn Annals. The Book of Changes you might have heard of, the I Ching, right? Every once in a while that, I don't know, it's on Oprah or something. People really love that. You can find it in Barnes and Nobles and stuff. But he says that we should study these books to get a sense of the sort of greatness of the past and then incorporate them. He also is big on this idea of the mandate of heaven, right? That was sponsored by the Duke of Zhou. If that's true, we need to recapture this idea. He refines it. He says, okay, cool, there's this sort of cyclical pattern where the ruler has the mandate of heaven, How do they get it? How do they keep it? What sort of moral and ethical behavior do they need to engage in to ensure that the mandate of heaven is with them? He also wants to sort of reinterpret the ethical and the philosophical in terms of its application to politics, which you get a sense of for sure when you're reading his work. He does not talk very much about religion or metaphysics. Afterlife, who cares? No heaven and hell. That's all kind of other stuff. He doesn't really talk about the gods very much. Metaphysical questions are questions about what is real, right? Is this really the real world we live in, or is there only one thing, or are there lots of different things, right? These classic philosophical problems. He's not really interested in that, but he's interested in a very practical guide to ethical behavior that we can follow that will sort of improve the universe around us. And if you're the leader and you do this, it improves the whole society. His teachings were compiled in the Analects. So just like most famous religious or philosophical figures, from Socrates and Plato and Jesus to, who's the guy? Well, anyway, lots of other ones, right? If you're familiar with any of these sort of religious or philosophical figures, they don't actually write the stuff themselves. They're written about. I guess I was thinking of Buddha, right? Siddhartha Gautama didn't really write anything himself either, right? All of his students did. Stuff like that. The same for Taoism, as we're going to find out. So it just is a common thing. They teach, and then the disciples are like, someone should be writing this down. Yeah. And then, hundreds of years later, that's refined into a school of thought or a religion in some cases. So he didn't actually do any of these writings. So when you read the Analects, there used to be that sort of stereotypical translation that was like, the master says, Confucius says this, just this. It's because it's being written by his disciples who are like taking notes. And they're like, the master said, whatever, Master Kong said this. So there are some key ideas that come out of the Analects in particular that come to define what Confucianism is all about. These ideas of Ren, Li, Xiao are really the big ones: benevolence, ritual, and filial piety. And you'll hear lots about this as you're reading through the book. Here's an example of some of these Confucius writings of the Analects. Actually, this isn't. This is from the Book of Songs, I think. Earlier on. Okay, so here's a sort of hot take on how this works from a sort of Confucian perspective. So it says, the former kings of Xia cultivated earnestly their virtue, and then there was no calamities from heaven, right? So he's saying, okay, look, this previous dynasty had virtuous leaders and things were good. But their descendants didn't follow this example, and heaven sent down calamities. Our king substituted this, his generous gentleness, and millions of people gave him their hearts. So he's basically explaining what happened in the early Zhou. Basically, the Shang were great, and then they weren't. And heaven stopped cooperating with them. They lost touch with the cosmic power, right? So instead, the Zhou came to power. I always hated it when professors read stuff, but here you go. Do you, who now succeed to the throne, revere these warnings in your person, right? So watch out for this. On the good doer, it sends down all blessings, and on the evil doer, it sends down all miseries. So if you're a king, or if you're a politician, or if you're in charge, you better watch out, because the universe is paying attention. If you do the right thing, good things happen to you and to society. If you do evil things, bad things happen to you and to society. If you be not virtuous, be it in large things or in small, it'll bring the ruin of your ancestral temple. Sounds pretty bad. So another thing that comes out of Confucianism, I'll tell you more about the filial piety and stuff in a second, is this idea of hierarchy and relationships. So In the US, we sometimes have problems with this. We like to pretend there's no sort of social hierarchies or whatever. There are, clearly. But we don't see that as very good. We see hierarchies, typically speaking, as bad. It's a very American trait. For Confucianism and what comes to define sort of East Asian culture broadly is that hierarchies are natural and good. So to some extent, this begins with Confucius. To some extent, he's just, reifying these ideas. So according to Confucius, basically all people are good. In their core, people are good. And what really matters is relationships between people. And he comes up with 5 types of relationships that exist everywhere. They're natural and they're good. And if we understand these really basic relationships, then we'll be able to sort of operate within the context of society in very meaningful ways. So in every Confucian relationship, there's a superior and there's an inferior. That's the hierarchical nature. The people on the top are people like the ruler, the husband, the father, right? Okay. The people on the bottom are subjects, wife, son, younger brother, that sort of thing. The people on the top are supposed to take care of the people on the bottom. They're supposed to be benevolent towards the people below them. That's kind of the buzzword. The people on the bottom are supposed to be obedient or loyal to the people at the top. So, if you're the ruler, and the easiest way to remember these is to start with the ruler and the subjects, and then it goes to every other relationship. If you're the emperor, you're supposed to be benevolent to all the people below you, right? You're supposed to be giving and helpful and nurturing and stuff like that. The subjects themselves are supposed to then be loyal and obedient to the emperor. So you can see why this idea is going to become popular with the aristocracy and the ruling class. But this main idea of sort of reciprocal hierarchies is in all of these relationships. So you have the emperor and the subject, but then you have this husband and wife, father and son, older brother, younger brother. The only Confucian relationship that's tricky is friend and friend. So theoretically, in the friend and friend, there's not necessarily a superior and inferior, although in reality, there often is, depending on the situation or what you're doing. So you might look at this and say, well, man, if I'm a woman, do I want to live in Confucian society? It seems a little grim, eh? So husbands are superior, wives are inferior. Wives should be loyal and obedient. Husbands should be benevolent. Also, older brother and younger brother, but you don't see anything about sisters, right? So women only really appear in here in a subservient role in one of the 5 relationships. Yeah, we'll get to more of that, but yeah, in some ways, Confucianism is not accommodating to women. In other ways, it's straight up hostile. But also, there is room for women to operate more broadly within societies, we're going to see. So it's a complex sort of role. In later days, women can, of course, be in these same relationships, older sister and younger sister, or friends and stuff like that. But it's just not part of the sort of classical canon of Confucian thought. Often women just aren't really talked about. So Confucius dies having done a lot of teaching. He has a lot of followers, and they immediately begin after his death to compile notes, compile his teachings, and a sort of civic religion or philosophy emerges that comes to be called Confucianism. People debate whether it's a religion, whether it's philosophy, all that sort of stuff. I don't really have any dog in that fight. I don't care. You can call it whatever you want. Anyway, once it sort of becomes a popular, public, commonly understood discourse or way of thinking about government, you start to see people that are trying to pick up that mantle and we would call them Confucian scholars, right? Or Confucian philosophers or something like this. They're people that want to take what Confucius did and make it even better. One of them is Menzi, or Mencius, right? Um, so he's going to come, you know, he's not a direct student of Confucius. Confucius had been dead for 100 years, but he's sort of in the lineage of scholars, right? So he is considered one of the main sort of Confucian scholars after Confucius to reify the religion and or the philosophy and sort of set up more of the standards and clarify some of the meanings. He was a very sort of optimistic person, and he had a really optimistic sort of take on what Confucianism was all about. In particular, he was really interested in the power of Ren. Again, in the book we're reading on Confucius, Ren is a really common idea. Ren is like human-heartedness, right? Or sometimes called humaneness. Ren is sort of like your connection to other people, your sort of humanity. And he basically says people, he's even more on the side of people are naturally good. And within everybody, this sense of Ren, this sort of humaneness we all share bonds us together, and really is what brings us to our best. He wasn't very influential when he was alive. However, after Confucius himself, he's probably the most influential thinker in the sort of broader school of Confucianism, right? So here is some of his writings on human nature, for example. So Menzi says, right, everyone has a heart that is sensitive to the suffering of others. The great kings of the past had this sort of sensitive heart and thus adopted compassionate policies. Bringing order to the realm is as easy as moving an object in your palm when you have a sensitive heart. Those who can fully develop them can protect the entire land, while those unable to develop them cannot even take care of their parents. Okay, so his take, developing a sensitive heart is what makes you a good ruler. Being attuned to the sufferings of others. If you have this, you're going to be able to be benevolent, right, to the people below you. And then in return, you'll get that loyalty, you'll get that respect. So it's about having basically the biggest heart possible, the best sense of understanding of your fellow human beings. This is what makes someone a good leader, a good ruler. If you can do this right, you can do everything. If you can't, how are you even taking care of your parents, right? So you can get that sort of sense of what he's talking about. This is Ren, this sort of this human nature, right? But not everybody is in that same way of thinking, even just amongst Confucians. So Sunji is a different Confucian scholar. He's also a major thinker, right? That's very influential, coming a little bit later. He was a Confucian scholar. He worked for the government, but he believed humans are not naturally that good. He's kind of breaking with things here. And he's saying that, yeah, okay, there's goodness in people, sure, but not necessarily everybody is sort of naturally good. Instead, he wants to focus on Li as the most important sort of Confucian idea. And Li is kind of a tricky idea. It's propriety and self-discipline, basically. Sometimes it's translated as the rites or as rituals. Often it's just sort of untranslated because it's its own sort of thing. Basically, you're going to be reading these Confucian texts too, right? So you'll get a sense of this. Confucius argued that there was a proper way to do things. There's a whole set of rituals and rites, and if we can participate in these things and do them correctly, we become better people. And you might think of a modern version of this is like turn signals. When you drive here in Georgia, many people just don't use them. What most Confucian scholars would say is that's wrong. You need to use them. It's a little ritual, right? Every time you turn, you go like that. It's so easy. Engaging in this little ritual is the right thing to do, just at a sort of moral level. If you don't do it, you are saying, I'm comfortable with increasing the chances that other people around me will die. It's just a fact. So for the Confucian scholar, they say, okay, cool, there's this little thing you can do. You do it. To you, it doesn't even really matter. You already know where you're turning, right? But it's a little sort of social ritual that we all have. In doing that social ritual, you improve all of society. The car behind you, if you didn't use the turn signal, they might get upset, right? You might piss them off. They might think you're cutting them off or whatever. Then you're sort of spinning more bad energy out into the world around you. Whereas when you do this little ritual, things are correct. That person behind you has no reason to be mad. They know where you're going. So these sorts of things, these little teeny self-discipline. I don't know if anyone makes their bed in the morning. If you make your bed in the morning, you will find the rest of your day goes better, at least from a Confucian perspective. They say, look, first thing, right? You start the day doing something. It's a little task. You've already completed something, right? Every morning. It makes the aesthetic of the room nicer, of course. It gets it all ready for you. But also it just sort of reaffirms your commitment to like start your day with purpose. The actual ritual of making the bed, who cares? But the effect it has on you can be profound. This is why if you were in the military, obviously one of the first things they make you do every day is make your bed, right? It's not just for fun. It's because that sort of ritual practice leads towards self-discipline, right? So that's what Junzi is arguing. Here you go on human nature. Here's his hot take. A warped piece of wood must be steamed and forced before it is made straight. A metal blade must be put to the whetstone before it becomes sharp. Since the nature of people is bad, to become corrected they must be taught by teachers, and to be orderly they must acquire ritual and moral principles. When people lack teachers, their tendencies are not corrected. When they do not have ritual and moral principles, then their lawlessness is not controlled. Seen from this perspective, it's obvious that human nature is bad, and good is a human product. Okay, so we're not all naturally good. We need teachers, we need leaders, we need people to pressure us in the right direction. We can do this through discipline, self-discipline, but also by understanding these other sort of social norms and sort of daily practices society can kind of shoehorn us all in the right direction, right? It's different thought. Okay, so Confucianism was not the only thing going on during this time, right? 100 schools of thought. I was just going to tell you about a few of them that are kind of the most central. In sort of seemingly in opposition in some ways to Confucianism, a different school is emerging called Taoism. Again, it's a religion, it's a philosophy, it's sort of spiritual, it's sort of mystic. Those distinctions that we make in the West don't necessarily work. So if you're thinking in terms of your Western history class for like religion and philosophy and stuff, that might not necessarily work in terms of the way these ideas work in Asia or East Asia in general. So the founder of Taoism, according to the sort of tradition, is Lao Tzu. So Lao Tzu is sort of a mystic. He's sort of a recluse. He's a sage. He lived sometime in the 6th century BCE, maybe. He might have been a collection of people, not rather than just one person. He's sometimes traditionally described as an archivist for the Zhou dynasty. So maybe he did work in the bureaucracy as an aristocrat. It's hard to say. His main idea was that we should reject active attempts to change events in the world around us. That we as human beings struggle to get what we want. But when we do that, we actually sort of lose touch with what is. And being in touch with what is actually the best way to get things done. The writings of Lao Tzu, or at least the ones that are attributed to sort of him and his sphere, is the Tao Te Ching. Oftentimes just shortened in the sort of English, right, to just the Tao or something like this. So again, if you go into a bookstore, you can definitely find it. It's around the Tao Te Ching or the Tao. It's a book of his thinking. It's unclear if he wrote it, and it's about all of the various sort of practices that might lead one towards being connected to what is rather than what we want to happen. And I'll give you some examples of that in just a second. It contains the sort of main ideas of Taoism. But Lao Tzu was not the only Taoist thinker. Another major one is Zhengzi. Zhengzi is a sort of intellectual disciple of Lao Tzu much later on, a few hundred years later. He doesn't write a book like the Tao Te Ching or something. He writes stories, and he writes metaphors about how the world works. Two of his most famous ones are Dream of the Butterfly and Cook Ding. I'll give you those as well. Okay. Yeah, there's the section of the Tao Te Ching. I forgot I put that in there. There he is, Zhongzi. Okay. So what is the Tao? The Tao is often just translated as the way. It's the sort of reality of the universe. This is going to get a little funky if you're not hip to this sort of stuff. The Tao is like the continuity around us. It's not a particular thing or a particular entity or power. One way of thinking about the Tao is like water. What color is water? What flavor is it? What shape is it? I'm assuming you don't have horrible water. Then it does have a taste. But so Lao Tzu might say something like, look, water is colorless, it's kind of flavorless, it's shapeless, it's formless, yet it moves, and it can take any shape. You pour it into a vessel, it's the shape of that vessel. It's extremely soft. You can scoop it up with your hand, but it's also incredibly powerful and cuts giant canyons into rock walls. So the Tao is like this. The universe, the sort of energy around us is the same way. You don't see it, you don't smell it. It seems like we're just in the universe, but really there's this tremendous amount of power to be drawn on. Also, paradoxically, and might make it more fun for you, if you know what the Tao is, you're wrong. Because the Tao is not something that can be pinned down and described. So if anyone says, yes, I know what the Tao is, it's this, they're already wrong. The way that can be spoken of is not the constant way, right? So if you know what the Tao is, you don't know, right? It's getting tricky. One of the ideas that comes out of this, or that comes out of the Tao Te Ching, is this idea of wu wei. So wu wei is just non-action or inaction. So if we're going to be like water in a sense, if we're going to participate in the universe, it's important that we don't try to assume a constant form or force things to happen or to be something we're not or to push too hard for something. Because when you do that, that's actually when you mess things up. So for example, if you want to hold, someone gives you, a handful of sand. Well, if you hold it with a nice gentle hand, it's actually much easier. If you try to actually grab it really hard to make sure that no sand gets out, that's when all the sand falls out of your hand. So basically what he's saying is you don't need to do things in order for things to happen. Now this sounds tricky. I want to eat breakfast, right, when I get up. I put a brisket in the oven. I better do something later, right? Or else that brisket's not gonna be what I want it to be. But in a broader sense, what he's arguing is things like morality, or human invention, or interceding in the universe around them is artificial anyway and might be counterproductive. The universe knows what it's doing and it's doing something. The energy is doing something or not doing something. And that's fine. And it's when we try really hard to force it to do something, it falls apart, right?
This is the way.
This is the way.
This is the way. It is the way, yeah. Okay, so what is the way? Can I tell you a little bit more about this, or this non-action stuff? So here's from the Tao Te Ching, a section on Wu Wei, and it says, when beauty is recognized in the world, ugliness has been learned. When good is recognized in the world, evil has been learned. Okay, so there's this sort of oppositional idea, right? Like you can't have something beautiful without something ugly. By even defining what good is, you're also sort of defining what it's not, right? What bad is. By bringing good into the world, you also have to bring evil into the world, for example, right? In this way, alive and dead are abstracted from growth, difficult and easy abstracted from progress, far and near abstracted from position, strong and weak from control. So we have these ideas of things, and when we get an idea, all kinds of other stuff manifests. We see growth happening around us in the world, right? If anytime you see nature. And from that, we get this sense of things being alive or dead. But that's sort of a human interpretation of what's happening, right? So the sage controls without authority and teaches without words. He lets all things rise and fall, nurtures but does not interfere, gives without demanding, and is content. So you control without authority, right? That sounds pretty good. Teaches without words. Might be kind of hard in the online environment and all. But just lets things fall and rise, right? Doesn't force things. One of the good lines from the Tao Te Ching is like, today I have done nothing and nothing remains undone. So you don't necessarily have to have these big plans and force things to happen. And in fact, it's the people that are just in touch with the universe working that have the most sort of success in the universe, right? You get content. So what do all of these ideas look like in practice? I remember I told you there was another thinker, Zhuangzi, who was more in the sort of literary style. Here's one of his pieces of writing that someone else will read this time, so that's nice. I'll show you a little video called The Butterfly Dream. It gives you a sense of what he's thinking and what this might lead us to think if we embrace these ideas of Taoism. about sort of duality. So let's check it out and then you can see what you think.
Once upon a time, I dreamt I was a butterfly, fluttering hither and thither. To all intents and purposes, a butterfly. I was conscious only of my happiness as a butterfly, unaware that I was a person. Soon, I awakened, and there I was, veritably myself again. Now, I don't know whether I was then a person dreaming I was a butterfly, or whether I am now a butterfly dreaming I am a person. Between a person and a butterfly, there is necessarily a distinction. The transition is called the transformation of material things.
Okay, so there's a guy having a dream that he's a butterfly, and then he wakes up. And right in that instant when he wakes up, there's this unclear moment where he's not sure if he's the butterfly or if he's the person. And he says this is the sort of the transformation of things. That's kind of an interesting translation. That's probably not the best one. But another way you could think of that is like, this is like being in touch with things, maybe. So really interesting idea, right? Like you have a nightmare and you wake up for a second, and in your nightmare, I don't know, you were being chased. Well, when you wake up, your heart's still beating really fast. You're still like a little bit more scared than you should be for some reason. Even kind of once you realize it was a dream, it still has this effect on you. Um, that's some of what is going on there. But also, they say, you know, there must be some difference between being a butterfly and being a person. There must be some way we can differentiate who we are sort of within the universe, right? We're separate from these things. But right in that moment where you're not quite sure, actually, there's something there going on that's pretty cool. In a way, you're kind of more in touch with what might be than you are when you're so hard in your opinion that you're not the butterfly. Um, so anyway, let that kick around in there for a bit, right? These are very sort of esoteric ideas. Here's another one, also from Zhengzi, um, called Cook Ding Cuts Up an Ox. I'll just let you read it. I'm not going to read the whole thing for you this time. Go ahead and just pause it for a second and read it if you can, and see what it's saying about this cook, and then we can talk about it. Okay, so what's going on here with this cook cutting up an ox? It's kind of an interesting little story, right? There's this guy who cuts up the oxes for sacrifices, basically like big barbecues, but he never has to sharpen his knife because he doesn't go against the grain, he doesn't hack through the bone, he doesn't force things. He just slides his knife perfectly where there's already the separation. So there's a natural separation between the muscle and the bones. There's a natural separation between the tissues. If you actually had the skill to just move in those spaces, your knife would never, you know, become dull because you would never actually really be cutting anything, right? And almost in a sense. So he's saying basically like if you go with the flow to the extreme, you don't have to make the space. The space is already there for you to do your thing. You don't have to create the situation. The situation is already there. And in a sense, if you can get into those literal like grooves, right? You get into the groove of it and you operate in a specific way, it's so easy. It becomes so clear. You're not forcing anything. it's just finding that sort of natural context, right, is what makes it possible. A pretty interesting story. Uh, okay, we'll see more on Taoism. It's just a very light sort of introduction into Confucianism as well, as though you're going to be reading a lot more about that. Another idea that's going to become quite popular is legalism. This isn't what they called themselves, of course, but this is the sort of, English interpretation. So legalism was less of a sort of school of thought or a religion and more practical techniques for governance. And this might be compared to, if any of you have read The Prince by Machiavelli, right, or heard about something being Machiavellian, this idea of sort of very practical hands-on techniques for leadership that might not necessarily be moral or ethical, because that doesn't matter. What matters is the practicality of the leadership. So in the sense of legalism, this was created in China by Lord Shang. Here's a much more modern painting of him, right? There's no depictions of him from the time. We don't know when he was born or anything, but he dies 338 BCE, so he's towards the end of this Zhou period, and he is actually going to be important in the Qin state coming up, as is Han Feiji, who was one of his students. So what legalism argues is people are not naturally good. People are in desperate need of a strong hand to sort of force them in the right direction. And this is done through the state. And what makes a strong, good state? Just two things, really: a strong agriculture and strong military. If you have farmers that are producing a lot of food, and you have a military with the best technology that's capable of kicking ass, your state is going to be strong. So under a sort of legalist ideals, you need to emphasize the peasantry and the soldiers. And you need to make them loyal, hardworking. You need to give them the good technology. You need to get them involved in the state. Also, since people are not naturally good and you can't rely on Ren or even people engaging in rituals or any of this sort of stuff, you need a series of rewards and punishment. That's how you get people to do things. Legalists also had a distrust for sort of intellectual and cultural pursuits. Who cares about flower arranging, right? Or writing characters in a certain way? Nah, that's all garbage. What people need is a set of tools and practices that are pragmatic and functional that make society better. One of the slogans, particularly from Han Feiji, is "Rich country, strong army." And we're going to see this again, actually, as we get closer to the 20th century. Japan is going to take up this motto, and it's reiterated in different periods in Chinese history. But the sort of modern Japan is going to use this slogan as part of their interpretation for why they need to attack Korea and China in some senses. So we'll see that come back. But it's starting even here, very, very early on. This idea that if you have wealth and a strong army, then you can't fail, right? Those are the two sort of big pillars for what you need to be a successful state. That's a statue of Han Feiji. So here's something from the book of Lord Shang's, right? These are these original principles of legalism. So the way to administer a state well is for the laws regulating officials to be clear. Okay, that makes sense, right? One does not rely on men to be intelligent and thoughtful. The ruler makes the people single-minded so they will not scheme for selfish profit. Then the strength of the state will be consolidated, and the state whose strength has been consolidated is powerful. But a country that loves talking is dismembered. Yeah, so you can't count on people to be smart or thoughtful, right? The average person is kind of dumb and not very thoughtful. Okay, it's one way to view, people. If that's your basic view of people, you need strong leadership that's going to force people to do certain things. The it's going to consolidate power, right? If you just want to sit around and talk philosophy and stuff, that's cool, but your state is going to get destroyed. So this is a very practical, sort of slightly militaristic approach, authoritarian approach towards how you create a strong nation, right? We're going to see all of these philosophies again, so don't worry about it. Okay, so by about 500 BCE, the Zhou was sort of falling apart. Despite all of these different new philosophies and thoughts and Confucianism and Taoism circulating and people really working to get a sense of what makes for the best in society, it wasn't working. So you get what comes to be called the Warring States period. So technically this is still the Zhou, but the Zhou have kind of lost authority and power, and all of those sort of sub-districts are fighting and reorganizing and becoming bigger states at the expense of smaller states, right? So the Zhou are starting to collapse, but it's like a slow collapse. During this time, there's hundreds of wars, 590, recorded wars during this period, but tons and tons of innovation. People are desperate and they're in competition. There's lots of military conflict, there's economic conflict, and sometimes this can push people towards innovation because they want to win or just they want to survive. So in this map, you can kind of see some of the new states that are forming. And again, if you look right in the middle there, there's like that gray area. That's the seat of the Zhou. Technically, that's the center of the dynasty around Luoyang. But it's not very big, right? All the other states are bigger. There's lots of other stuff going on. And there's a new sort of international system forming. You can see these different states, the Zhao, the Ji, Wei, the Qin, right? These states are starting to operate much more independently of the Zhou dynasty, and they're doing things like engaging in their own diplomacy, their own sort of marriages for gaining land or political influence, truces with each other within this system. So the Zhou is like an overriding, unifying force, is pretty much gone. But lots of stuff is happening. During this time, for example, you see all kinds of new innovations in armor and technology. Well, why is that? Well, there's a lot more war going on. If you're engaging in tons of battles, one of the ways to keep your soldiers alive is to try and develop new techniques for protecting them, right? Also during this time, there's big innovations in farming. This is when you start to see a lot of row planting. And here's a sort of picture of that. If you haven't seen it, here's some nice rice. Although rice wasn't necessarily super common up north yet as much. But you start to see it incorporated. You have books on rice farming that are starting to move around. People are starting to get rice kind of all over what we think of as China. And farmers are more or less independent. As long as you pay your taxes and as long as you don't take up with the wrong crowd of, militia marching through or something, most farmers would have not necessarily, well, they would have owned their own land in a sense. I mean, they couldn't necessarily sell it and all that sort of thing, but you didn't do that sort of stuff anyway. But you weren't directly under anyone's control. Also, something interesting that happened during the Warring States period with all of these different governments forming is you get a sort of new economic system. Because all of these governments are using currency, right? They have printed coin technology. Each state has its own sort of unit. Well, when you have different sort of currencies, you have to figure out what is equivalent to what. So this actually creates sort of almost like a currency exchange market or sort of a complex system where if you travel from one area to the other, you have a currency. You have to figure out what it's worth in the other area and be able to exchange it. So this is really sort of advanced economic activity. So even though you look at the name, or when people are thinking about these dynasties, they're like, Warring States period, that sounds, like something bad is happening. Yeah, you wouldn't want to necessarily live in China at this time, comparatively. There was a lot of conflict between these states, but also a lot of new stuff developing as well, right? Sort of out of necessity. So of all of these warring states, basically the last one standing was the Qin. So the Qin are going to eventually, in their eyes, inherit the mandate of heaven and be able to beat all of their enemies around them and establish a empire that is much larger and deeper in scope than the Zhou ever had. It's actually a hands-on, emperor-led sort of empire, but it's really short-lived. It's only for the life of the founder. Then the dynasty ends. Yet, it sets up then one of the longest-lasting, most influential dynasties in Chinese history. So let's take a look at the Qin and see what's happening here. Okay, so the Qin are not coming out of nowhere. They were one of the states of the Zhou. So remember, in the Zhou Empire, there were the different sort of sections that reported, the sort of provinces. But as the central state is disintegrating, all of these provinces are getting stronger and stronger, sort of making their own way. And then with the Warring States period, the Zhou have really fallen apart. And all of these independent states are sort of duking it out for who's going to be in charge next, who can gain the mandate of heaven. Everyone sort of knows this, but it takes a long time to sort of happen. So from the fringe of the sort of Chinese world, the Qin are considered civilized Chinese, kind of, but they're at the edge. They're not part of the main sort of court life or something like this, but because they're kind of far out on the fringe, they're closer to the sort of wealth coming through Central Asia. So this is right when those sort of long-standing elements of exchange between and across Afro-Eurasia are picking up a little bit more, and the Qin are well positioned to profit from that, getting exposed to new technologies, new revenue streams, all that sort of stuff. Also, the Qin were very famous for accepting outsiders and immigrants, and they believed that by incorporating other people, they would get deeper perspectives and they would get more ability to sort of increase the variety and sort of dimensions of their own society. So one of the people, the Qin, actually was an immigrant to the state of Qin, was Lord Shang, right, who initiated legalism and all of those ideas. So Lord Shang is going to help the Qin establish itself as a strong state. And the way they do this is, as the Warring States period is going on, the Qin say we need to reform our society, we need to strengthen the state, and we need to standardize kind of everything within the state. So how do we do that? Well, one thing we got to do is we got to get rid of any leadership that's not the best. If you're in a position of power because you know somebody's uncle or because it's your kid or whatever, that's garbage. The Qin said, look, you should have a meritocracy, not only for leadership, but who gets to be wealthy. So if you are better, stronger, faster, that's it, right? A meritocracy just means that the people who are in charge are picked due to their merit. So this is quite different from the way a lot of kingdoms and empires work. So it wasn't necessarily about lineage, or even if it was, the new members of the dynasty or lineage would have to prove how great they were. So In 247 BCE, we're still going to be in BCE for a while, there is a new king, Ying Jiang. He thinks that he has a pretty good shot at taking out the rest of the warring states. He is kind of at the tail end of a couple of kings who have really supported growth in Qin. It's a rising sort of economic and military power, but they've also avoided some of the conflict thus far because they're on the sort of fringe, right? So he seeks to conquer the rest of the warring states, put an end to this sort of time of chaos, and unify this sort of Chinese world again, with him at the head of it, right? Along the way, lots of people try to kill him, and he survives, which is the point of a fantastic movie, which you may or may not have seen, called Hero. I'll play you a little clip of that in a second. But here you go. There's Lord Shang again. Remember, he's the one that's going to initiate these sorts of reforms. And here's our guy, Jiang. But he's not going to be Jiang for very long, actually. We'll see. Yeah, there's an assassin trying to kill him, depicted in stonework. Okay, so as Jiang proceeds to take over the other warring states, he's going to slowly transition to becoming an emperor of this new dynasty. When he does, he's going to take an imperial name, Qin Shi Huangdi. So Qin is just the name of the family, the dynasty, right? But it's interesting because Shi Huangdi, you know, right? We've already seen Huangdi, right, which was Yellow Emperor when it was spelled with the character for yellow. This character is a little bit different, and Huangdi is just gonna be emperor. So he just like names himself emperor, right? So he's gonna be the emperor of this new dynasty, the Qin. But if you look at his reign years, when you see that little R and then the dates, that's the date that he's in power. So 222 or 221 to 210. Pretty brief. And then the dynasty ends in 207. So after his death, really the Qin dynasty is over. It's really just Shi Huangdi that's like the dynasty. And after he dies, that's it. So how does he rule? How does he come to power? What's happening? Well, he employs legalism as the main official ideology of the state. So remember, people are bad, basically. They need to be forced to do things. You need a strong central leadership. You need standardization. And Shi Huangdi has a large centralized bureaucracy. So there is a huge class of government workers, essentially, judges, others, that run the state. Judges is just an easy thing, and it's sort of a blanket term in sort of this period in Chinese history and elsewhere. Bureaucrats, if you don't know, are the sort of people who make the government run. They're the everyday functionaries. When you go to the DMV and you're trying to get your license and they have to like call up the person in the back who can decide on some silly issue or whatever, that's a bureaucrat. You might consider members of Congress and all of their aides and staff and stuff like part of the bureaucratic apparatus, right, of the US. So all the sort of functionaries of government. So he has a huge corpus of these people. He also believes that you should engage in massive public works projects. So remember, you have to promote the military and the peasantry, right, under legalism. Well, one great way to keep the people busy while giving them some money is to engage in massive public works. So building new canals, new walls, new defensive structures, new roads, You can employ lots and lots of people, which is good, and you can also then increase the efficiency of the state. If there's big roads that stretch out to the ends of the empire, it's easy to march your military there or engage in commerce further out. He has a giant military, right? So again, that's the main way of power. It's not politics and moral authority and nah, who cares? If you have a big military and you can march them out to the edge of the earth, you can keep those people in tow, right? And well, what is it that he's trying to keep all in tow? It's a sort of standardized, unified state. He's done with all those multiple coins and different provinces and everything like that. There's just one empire, right? Just the Qin state in terms of leadership and ruler power. It's not diffuse, it's very centralized. The same with the economy, right? So here you go, here's the Qin dynasty at its absolute height. Those defensive wall structures you might see up there, right? You might be thinking, aha, this is the Great Wall. It's part of it. The Great Wall as a thing is not going to be around for a while, but these are part of those large public works. What are you doing with these series of big walls up there? Well, you're trying to keep out those horse riding outsiders. Remember, we saw the Zhou dynasty initially succumb to these like steppe barbarians who sacked their capital, and that's the way that sort of trickled down. They started to lose power. Shi Huangdi is not going to have that. He hopes to keep these people at bay. Also, you can see this is a really expansive state. He's expanding now down almost all the way into southern China in a way that the sort of Chinese people had not before. So the people that are down in southern China at this time were not considered Chinese, not in the same sense as this main sort of body. So you can see labeled here, there's that big area, the Yue, who are not Chinese. These people are going to lead to like Hakka and other groups of Chinese, sort of. We'll get there later. Remember, China is a big multi-ethnic, multiracial, multilinguistic place. It's not one thing. And so this new Qin dynasty this empire is taking over lots and lots of other people that speak different languages, have different cultural practices, eat different foods, and sort of folding them within one empire. But according to legalism and the sort of way Shi Huangdi wants to operate, everything should become more and more standardized. If you're one of the people that lives out in the hinterland and you sort of speak a different language and you sort of eat different food and you have different, clothes, you might not love this, right? So there's certain elements that are going to get unified and certain ones that aren't. But you can see this huge expansive state, right, that's being created. Here's some coins from the Qin dynasty. So now, instead of having all of these different types of coins, you just have one issued by the state. So you have one centralized economy, which is great for some things, right? It means that there's a sort of standard of currency all around this huge empire, but it means all of those little districts are no longer independent, right, in a lot of ways. Here's a massive army, and the Qin military reached some incredible sizes. The biggest militaries in the world during this sort of period, or in this sort of early, classical era, much bigger than anything the Greeks were doing or something like that. The Persians also had really large armies, if you're hip to that too, but the sort of scale of this is what made the Qin dynasty function. These other warring states just couldn't compete with the sort of massive scale of it. But not everybody loved this, right? When you see these guys marching towards you, you and your community might not want to be part of the empire, right? So Shi Huangdi had to put lots of policies in place to sort of force people to abide by this new sort of imperial system. He created really quickly this vast empire with tons of different people in it, but demanded a very centralized rule. So of course you get lots of resistance. So what do you do about that? Well, the first thing you might do is you might execute all of your critics, or as many of them as you can catch. If you start executing other nobles or aristocrats or philosophers or, rebels, resistance, peasant leaders, pretty quickly you might have less of them around, even if those people are just sort of hiding their ideology. You get less sort of public resistance. He also was not a fan of ideological texts. So remember all those different 100 schools of thoughts? He doesn't like them. Lots of them have complicated critiques of what makes a good leader. He doesn't want to hear any of that. He knows what makes a good leader, and he's doing it. And there shouldn't be any sort of debate about what is a good emperor and all this sort of stuff. So famously, Shi Huangdi has lots of books burned that are sort of threatening or from a different sort of perspective than the one he's espousing. He famously hated scholars, although he surrounded himself with bureaucrats who had to be, learned people. They had to know how to read and write and all that sort of stuff. They had to be numerically literate and all that. He didn't like the sort of scholarly class of intellectuals that are educated to be educated or educated to be functionaries, specifically within the government. This is going to change a lot later on. So, for example, one famous story about Shi Huangdi is that he was drunk at a party, and there happened to be some poor scholar at the party, and he took off the scholar's hat, and he flipped it upside down, and he peed in it, sort of showing everybody in the place what he thought of scholars and all. There's also a famous story that he once ordered hundreds of scholars to be burned alive. It's unclear if that's true. These scholars that he hated so much were primarily Confucian. Later, Confucians are going to come to be much more powerful and the sort of central parts of governments. So when they're writing the histories, they might be sort of exaggerating some of these things. It's unclear. But it is clear that he did exile many sort of top intellectuals and political leaders. Now, this is kind of interesting because the way Qin got powerful in the first place was by accepting and embracing all kinds of different ideas and immigrants and people like Lord Shang, who was an outsider who had a cool new idea. But once he came to power, he didn't really want cool new ideas. He didn't want anybody from outside, right? So this is sort of a double-edged sword. Sometimes people use a particular tool to come to power, but then they don't want that tool to exist anymore because that's what allowed them to come to power over someone else. They don't want other people to do it. So some people argue that during the reign of Shi Huangdi, actually there was a sort of massive cultural loss. That all of these scholars and thinkers were dissipated or abused. Books were burned because people had to standardize their language and writing and other things like this. Something was lost. That might be sort of overblown. Scholars have argued that maybe that's not necessarily true and that that's like a later interpretation. Also, people write for the next 1,000 years or so after this about all the resistance to Shi Huangdi, but it's unclear how much resistance there was or where it was. And a lot of it is sort of part of popular stories and discourse made into movies. Fantastic movie Hero, right? If you haven't seen that with Jet Li, where he's the hero, sort of. How much resistance was there? Well, certainly all of the sort of other warring states on the way to Qin becoming a dynasty were actively resistant, right? They didn't want this. But later, Chinese scholars reflect and say, well, this was a great time because one thing really interesting happened. In particular, the Chinese language, the written language, was standardized. Shi Huangdi forced this sort of one particular set. There were all kinds of different Chinese characters that were sort of overlapping and sort of different ways of writing. And under his government, there was one more standardized way to do it. And this becomes the sort of central narrative. It's also the main theme of Hero. So here, let me show you this little clip, and then we can see kind of what you think of it. Oh yeah, here's scholars and books being burned, right, that may or may not be accurate.
长空飞雪残剑分别以不同方式捐出自己，助你上殿10步来刺寡人。此3人能把生命托付给你，人生之急也莫过于此。所以你才是最危险的刺客。
大王何以识破？
寡人面前的烛火，感到了你的杀气。他们3人还有你，舍身取义，寡人自愧不如。
大王毕竟识破了，
寡人也是刚刚识破。 否则，怎会容你进我10步？秦人不会刺我，你到底是谁？
臣实为赵人，臣家人被秦军所杀，自幼流落在秦，被秦人收养。10年前知道身世，便决心行刺，
为赵而来。寡人明白了。 寡人想知道，你练的快剑名称。
如大王所猜，藏有一事。
哪一事
？10步一杀。
10步一杀，好名字。寡人的卫士均在殿外的100步之遥，而你竟寡人以10步。看来，寡人今日是难逃此劫。
Okay, so pretty sweet little clip there. Jet Li, who's the main guy, is actually from a different state, right? One of the old warring states. But in this depiction, in the movie, Shi Huangdi is depicted as sort of a sage hero who has an intent. Even though he is an authoritarian, even though he destroys lots of people and communities, and people want to assassinate him and all this stuff. Really, he has this master plan for creating sort of unified China. Now, of course, this is a movie in the 20th century, right? Like late 20th century. And it's a sort of wish fulfillment in some ways. The sort of modern, current Chinese history sees Shi Huangdi as like the first uniting force behind creating China as a thing. But China as a thing, like it is today, wasn't created until the 20th century. So Shi Huangdi he wasn't sitting around thinking, yes, I'm uniting all the Chinese people and it's going to be awesome and in the future there'll be these Chinese states and stuff. Nah, not at all, right? He was a state fighting with other states. He wanted to win. He had an expansive empire. He wanted to rule it with an iron fist. So it's a bit precarious to sort of reinterpret him that way. Anyway, that movie Hero, check it out if you haven't seen it. It's pretty fantastic. So famously, the Qin dynasty is going to fall apart immediately after Shi Huangdi dies. As he gets near the end of his life, he becomes obsessed with these sort of arcane rituals and magic, and hopes to extend his life forever. He saw himself as a sort of semi-divine being who could once he became immortal, sort of continued to rule perhaps one day the whole world. And he used lots and lots of resources on extending his life and preparing for his death and entombment. And it's unclear whether he thought he was going to be resurrected or whether this would sort of somehow prevent him from dying, right? There's a lot of stuff going on. So he uses a ton of resources of the state to begin his tomb even while he's still alive. His tomb is absolutely huge. It's more than 20 miles in circumference. It's a whole complex of house structures and buried structures. He had tons and tons of people working on it, right? Hundreds of thousands of workers were working on his tomb. It was incredibly elaborate. This is where the terracotta warriors are. One aspect of the tomb was he has a whole series of armies buried with him. Here's some of them. Their hands look like that because they were all originally holding weapons. These were buried. Some farmer found a head. Nobody knew about these things until the 20th century. They'd been completely forgotten for thousands of years. And a farmer found a terracotta head in his field, and he was like, "Oh, this looks important." Eventually, the state. This is like in the 1950s, 1960s. The state sent out some archaeologists to come, and they find all these terracotta warriors. When they first dig them up, they're all painted, really elaborate yellows and blues and stuff. But within a couple days, the colors start to fade, and the colors have all disappeared for most of them, because once the ink was exposed to the air again, they just, stripped right off. So there's still hundreds of thousands of these things buried that haven't been dug up, because for now they're all colorful. Once they dig them up, the color's going to fade. So the Chinese government and archaeologists have been working to how to preserve that, especially because all these terracotta warriors, when you first dig them up, they're all broken in pieces. So anyway, they're not digging them up yet. But here's a further away picture, right, showing you the size of this. Here's a further away. This is like a giant airport hangar, basically, that they have built over part of the excavated site. So you had whole, divisions, battle formations of individual soldiers, horses, chariots, lined up that were sort of guardians, or maybe would be some sort of military that he would have in the afterlife. So we see some echoes here of the Shang, right? Remember, the Shang did bury themselves with people and animals that they hoped to have in the afterlife, and then we didn't really see that, and the Zhou didn't do that in this way. The Zhou get rid of that. They don't do human sacrifices and stuff. And here it doesn't appear that he, in the Qin, was taking anyone with him or anything like that. But these workers, the terracotta bodies came out of a factory, but the individual heads were made by the workers themselves to sort of be their own faces. So each face is unique on these guys. It's really incredible. So the empire kind of falls apart pretty quickly. And there's a historian, Chinese historian in the Han Dynasty, who's going to write about what happened. And he's going to write, Sima Qin is his name. He's going to write about why the Qin fell apart. And he says, why? Because the ruler lacked humaneness and righteousness, because preserving power differs fundamentally from seizing it. So later in the Han Dynasty, people are going to reflect on what happened. This guy was able to beat all his enemies, establish this huge expansive state, and yet it collapsed pretty quickly. It only existed for 15, 20 years. There were constant rebellions. There were all kinds of problems. There was eunuch intrigue. There you go. If you don't know what a eunuch is a boy or a young man who has his testicles removed, sometimes all of his genitals removed, to prevent him from, the idea was you need a lot of servants in the palace. But you don't want them to impregnate any of your wives, and you don't want them to be too aggressive. So what do? Well, you castrate them. That keeps them from from, well, one, they can't sire any children, they can't sleep with any of your mistresses, nothing like that. But also the idea is because they can't have families, that they won't be as concerned with their legacy, they won't be scheming, they won't try to create some sort of legacy for themselves so they can be more trustworthy. Actually, as it turns out, though, that's not really true. This was an old sort of tradition within Chinese society, and we're going to see it right up until the 20th century, that the dynasties, the sort of imperial powers, employ eunuchs for all kinds of bureaucratic positions and for sort of people that are close to the royal families and the aristocracy. But they also have their own motives. If you've seen, again, Game of Thrones, man, they do their own thing. So lots of sort of eunuchs were vying for power within this new dynasty as well, and maybe that caused some problems. They're also kind of a stock character that people blame when things go bad. So we'll see that again coming up during the Han Dynasty. Here you go. Here's some more eunuch intrigue. This is an actual picture from the time rather than just the magic card there. So immediately after the Qin falls apart, a new dynasty arises. And this becomes a sort of trope in Chinese history when you're thinking about dynasties. There's almost always a sort of rise and fall aspect where one kind of goes into the other, and it's seen as like the way it works. As we're going to find out, that's not how it actually works, but it is the way people talk about it. And a couple of times with both Qin and Han and Sui and Tang later, there's one dynasty that sort of kicks it off, makes some changes, but is relatively short-lived, and then jumps into a much longer, more steady situation based on that previous dynasty. So the Qin manages to take over. Shi Huangdi manages to build this huge empire, but he can't hold it. It's unstable. He dies. There's no successor, right? So it falls apart. But the stage is set for a big empire. People are lined up to hold what they have. This idea of this expansion is already in the cards. So the Han are going to build on that pretty much immediately. So the way this comes about is actually right after Shi Huangdi's death. There's a sort of civil war between multiple factions within the Qin world. So remember, Shi Huangdi had really quickly taken over lots of little areas. He'd only unified this entire state for 15 or 20 years. So there was still a memory of different regions, different states that he had put down by force. So there were people from different areas and from within Qin itself that fought for something else. So two of them in particular in 207 come in real hard swinging, and they mess up any chance that the Qin have of continuing their dynasty. The two guys are Xiang Yu, who was a general. He was from an aristocratic family, and Liu Bang. So Liu Bang is not an aristocrat. He was born a peasant. He was in law enforcement, and then he sort of rose through the ranks in his province. Eventually, he was made a general in charge of an army. So Liu Bang and Yu are going to initially kind of work together in a sense to topple the Qin and usher in a new state. But the two have different ideas about who should be in power, and quickly they turn on each other. So it's sort of a civil war against the Qin, but also factional within the sort of movement. And in the end, Liu Bang is going to win. And this is kind of a big deal because he's not the high-ranking aristocracy. He's not a noble person. He wins because he is just a better general, and he's able to marshal more political capital as well. And when he beats out his former friend, he establishes a new dynasty. He says, okay, from now on, we are the Han. And he takes a new name, as emperors do, Han Gaozu. So Gaozu is the same guy. This is always confusing. There's going to be two names for people. Liu Bang, Han Gaozu, same guy. He establishes the Han dynasty, and he has some ideas. In part, his peasant background and his background in law enforcement are really helpful. He saw what the Qin did, and he liked the idea of the big consolidated empire and the central government. But he also saw all the peasant rebellions and the crime that was coming from that, and thought about why that was happening. And he said one of the reasons the peasants are so uppity and rebelling all the time is because taxes were too high. Shi Huangdi was taxing people too much, trying to build his tomb, trying to consolidate this empire. Now that we have this big empire, we can relax a lot of the tyranny. And this is often the way states work, right? You need someone to break all the eggs so that someone else can eat the omelet later on. So Liu Bang is going to build on top of what Shi Huangdi did. But he doesn't have to be a tyrant to do it. All the mechanisms are already in place. He just kind of has to keep it running. So he gets more of a sort of relaxed posture, and people are more willing to accept him because he's not the tyrant that was before. Also, Han Gaozu is going to reinvigorate scholars as a sort of social class and as the bureaucratic class that leads the government. He is going to see them as absolutely essential. Now, there's a couple of reasons you might do this, right? Having just taken over, the whole mandate of heaven concept might be pretty good. You might want people to reinforce that. But also remember those Confucian relationships and that idea of like the leader being benevolent and the subjects being, loyal. This is a great sort of philosophy or ideology to espouse if you're in a position of leadership. It works really well for you. So he's going to figure out that by incorporating these people into the bureaucratic system, he gets kind of more authority and power and legitimacy internally, right? Here's the Han early on. The extent's about 100 BCE, so kind of in the early days. So you can see that pretty quickly there's this big chunk that they're able to take over as the Qin fell apart. But now you can see also that kind of southern portion. There's still people down there, the Minyue, who are not part of the dynasty, right? These people are more closely connected to those Neolithic people who were in the south, right, along the Yangtze River. But they've been kind of pushed sideways a little bit because the Han Empire is able to get all the way down into like modern day Vietnam. So they're able to sort of push those people a little bit, but those people are not incorporated into the state. Also, you can see the Han are on what's now the Korean peninsula. So they're sort of pushing against the kingdoms that are there. We'll see that a little bit later. And you'll also notice this like weird stretch out into the desert very early on. That's kind of the area that Qin came from originally, remember? And I was telling you they were able to connect to that inter-Asian trade, that Central Asian sort of trade routes through the desert. This is why that's there. The Han are going to do the same thing, right? But you'll notice their area of control is somewhat limited early on. So the first thing that Han Gaozu tries to do is solidify his empire militarily and fortify it. And the threat is not the civil strife, it's not the peasants. He sort of reorients and he says, look, we're done with the Civil War. We're done with these bad empires. We've got our stuff together. The real concern is the people out there. It's always helpful if you can have an enemy. Nothing unites people like a common enemy, right? So Han Gaosu says, look, these people in the north, these horse riding people, they always plagued the Qin, they plagued the Zhou. We need to enforce our borders, we need to get rid of them. He sends a ton of troops up north to go sort of hunt and push and enforce getting rid of these horse riding peoples. But that kind of has a counter effect. There's all these different horse riding peoples in the north. They're different tribes, although I kind of hesitate to use that word because tribal has a whole, sort of weird colonial meaning, but they're different groups. They don't speak the same language. They don't count a common heritage. They come from different places, but they're all considered Yi people, right? Or like outside people, barbarians, right? By the main Chinese state. However, when Han Gaosu sends these forces up to like fight the horse people, basically this pushes them together and something new emerges. This group that starts to call themselves the Xiongnu, and the Han call them this too. It's basically a confederation of all of these different horse riding peoples, non-settled peoples, migratory peoples, people that are more into herding than agriculture, right? And they formed this confederation, the Xiongnu, as a way to resist the Han. So by actually trying to get rid of these people or push them, he sort of has named them and collectivized them. And the people themselves, the Xiongnu, are going to say, okay, yeah, we're kind of a group in opposition to that. They were not homogenous in any way. It's very hard to find, accurate depictions of them, in part because there's so many different peoples. This is an etching off of a carving, right, on rock, allegedly showing Xiongnu people. They were famous for being mounted archers, and they could attack quickly, they could run quickly. Because they had no particular home city, you can't invade it. So they quite rapidly defeated all of these Han forces that were sent north. The Han soldiers were less adept at horse riding. They were further from home. They didn't know the terrain. They hadn't been there as long. They were also, even though they were, maybe seasoned troops, they were also a little bit tired from the end of the Qin and the sort of civil wars there. So the Xiongnu actually managed to defeat these sort of organized Han forces, and they negotiate a long-term sort of peace with the Han. And what that means is that in the frontier lands, every once in a while, the Xiongnu will invade and steal crops and stuff like this. And the Chinese government won't punish them too harshly. In exchange, the Xiongnu will also maintain friendly relationships with these fringe areas otherwise. And they'll do things like sell them horses. They were horse breeders, right? So they can provide horses for the Chinese. Also, they raised lots of meat. So like in northern China, even still today, right, a lot more meat is consumed from animals like sheep and goats, sometimes horse, different types of cow, all that sort of stuff. Whereas in the south, you don't have as much of that. You have more chicken and other things. And that's sort of where that comes from to an extent. As part of this process, there's a huge sort of cultural exchange. And people in the sort of far northern reaches of sort of central China, or what we consider like the main area of China, get all kinds of influences. They get horses, music, clothes, dances, weapons, patterns, colors, right, from these people, language, and vice versa. And so the Xiongnu and the Han, like who's which one, when you get out to the frontier, it's pretty hard to tell sometimes. Here's a horse rider, right? It's hard to say exactly what she's doing, but certainly something cool on that horse, right? They were kind of legendary for horse riding skills from the Chinese perspective, and we're going to see that continue, right, in the future. So after Han Gaosu, who's the founder, the most famous emperor of the Han period is probably Han Wudi. Remember, whenever you see D at the end, right, that kind of means just emperor. So um, there's his reign years, which you can see 141 to 87 BCE. That's a huge period of time, right? Like more than 50 years. So Han Wudi rules for a very long time until he's a very old guy. And what makes him sort of so famous within the Han story is he massively expands the state. At the same time, he really consolidates centralized power. So by the reign of Han Wudi, you have a big, big, expansive empire, but it's also run very centrally from the capital. So even though the people on the fringes might not think of themselves as Chinese or Han or anything like that, even part of the empire, there is a sort of element of control from the middle all the way out. And the way he did this was quite clever, and it's basically a sort of colonization process or colonial process. The first thing that Han Wudi did that really added to the strength and power of the Han was he made Confucianism the official government philosophy, unlike legalism or something like this. So the way that you became a member of government was through the Confucian system, which is going to develop into a sort of meritocracy where you learn the texts, you learn about Confucianism. Eventually, you're going to take a test to prove how good you are at it. And when you do, you can become a government official, which enables you to work for the state, work as a tax collector, work as a judge, work as a teacher, all kinds of stuff like this. It's how you develop within the system. In order to promote this, Han Wudi established schools for Confucianism all throughout the empire. So in every major country seat or county seat or capital or province, you could find Confucian schools. So the people that were wealthy or the people that were elites or the people who wanted to be elites would send their sons, no women, to these Confucian schools to study the classics, study the texts, learn everything they could in preparation for this sort of exams or some kind of process that would make them valuable as a scholar. It's not quite the Confucian exam system yet, that's coming, but that's how you sort of make all of these other regions sort of buy in, right? Also, Han Wudi is going to break the peace with those Xiongnu. It's been a while. Yeah, I don't know, what has it been? It's been a couple hundred years. No, had it been a couple hundred years? Yeah, a couple hundred years of peace. And the Xiongnu Confederation wasn't, one solid thing. Again, it's sort of different. And Han Wudi had decided that there's all this sort of trade coming off what we're going to call the Silk Road a little bit later. And maybe the Xiongnu shouldn't be in charge of it. Maybe they shouldn't have as much power out there on the fringe. What if the Han could push them even a little bit further so that those sort of oasis towns or those sort of border towns where a lot of money and tax dollars came through could funnel into the pockets of the empire rather than to foreigners? He also believed very strongly in combining sort of military and cultural leadership. So he's taking that sort of Confucian idea about needing to be a scholar, needing to be very intelligent, a man of letters, but also he was a sort of martial leader as well, at least when he was younger, right? So here's a depiction by this time of what the Han state looks like when Han Wudi is in power. So it's evolved quite further, right? They've pushed down more into Vietnam, over into this sort of massive desert that's to the west of China, which is where some of those routes are. Also, you see that area labeled Mongolia. That's like what Mongolia is today. There are no Mongols yet. There's not Mongolia. It's just labeled that way. So that orange, or that sort of reddish orange area, that's where the Xiongnu were. But you can see there's those sort of overlapping borders, those frontier lands where who's in control varies. Han Wudi didn't want that. He wanted to extend power and push those Xiongnu out so that there would be more control over the trade routes and over certain resources, right? In particular, these sort of fortresses and towns out in the middle of nowhere that had been all along the trade routes. Every once in a while, the Xiongnu would take advantage of this and hit them. But the Han really reinforced this. They built more fortresses, they built more outposts. Oh, sorry, I was going to show you something on the Oasis towns. I'm sure I have that coming actually in a little bit. So that idea was you needed to really fortify the border even more than those walls and structures that we had seen before. So, okay, other than Han Wudi and the sort of founding and stuff, what did Han society look like? Actually, we start to have a pretty good idea. There's tons and tons and tons of writing during this time, and we have a lot of sense of what was going on from elites and regular people and women and artists and just the whole sort of spectrum of society. So the big news during the Han Dynasty was the sort of Confucian education system. So this becomes the basis, like I was saying, for education in general, how you become an elite, how you work for the government, how you become a bureaucrat, how you gain power and money. So there were the Imperial University was set up in the capital with tons and tons of students. By the end of Han, 30,000 students, right, in this imperial sort of university. But even more than that, there were schools everywhere. So in any town you went, Confucianism was seen as the sort of standard in terms of education and learning, and that really sort of drove a whole cultural milieu, to use some nice fancy words, but sort of it created a lot of buy-in from regular people and sort of connected the empire in a way that it might not have been otherwise. No matter where you went in the empire, you could find people who were schooled in Confucian learning, who espoused that philosophy and saw a sort of common character, sort of common cultural characteristic through that. Along with Confucianism, Han society experienced a massive change in demographics. So here's just a quick, like, little, you can kind of tell from the numbers how big it is, but even not quite. So 220 BCE to 9 CE, right? This section of the Han, you go from 20 million to 60 million people. So in about 230 years there, your population triples. That's really incredible in terms of pre-modern societies. Now, right, the doubling time on the Earth is pretty horrible. It's every 20 to 30 years. But at this point, having a population increase like that was way more sort of statistically improbable. So how did that happen? Well, there was lots of new foods. There was new cohesive unity, the promotion of the farmers that had been done under the Qin, right? All these sorts of things. We'll see some of those coming up. There also was a new sort of social class system that developed. Much more differentiation between different social groups. So obviously the best group to be in, other than like the aristocracy that was in charge of the dynasty, would be Confucians. So the more education you have, the higher sort of through the ranks of society you can climb. You know, you might be a local notable, but if your kid passes the Confucian education system and does really well, they might become a local notable in like a bigger town, or they might be a judge in the capital or something like this. So education created movement. Also, the elite were getting kind of wealthier and wealthier. That created new material culture. Those material cultures trickled down, right, to other people. Here's an example of the population, right, just so you can see the like main, where the population is most densely packed. And you can kind of see it's all along the Yellow River and that sort of section of northern China, with a few big hubs, right, in other places. But that sort of classical northern China area along the Yellow River is becoming really, really densely populated. So here you go. Here's a sort of outline of those new social classes. The emperor is at top of the world. Okay, that's good. Governors and kings, nobles, scholars, state officials, peasants, artists, merchants, soldiers, slaves. So this might not seem quite right to you. This is certainly not how we set up our social hierarchy. Emperor, kings, nobles, okay, that sounds good. I wish scholars were that high. They're not in the current like American model. But then peasants, which are the farmers. And then under them, artisans and merchants, and then under them, soldiers. So in the sort of Confucian worldview, and the worldview of legalism for that matter, right, that was popular under the Qin, farmers are important because they feed the nation. They constitute the main body public. And artisans and merchants provide entertainment and beauty and culture, and that's great. But Confucians are often sort of suspicious of merchants in particular because they don't necessarily work to create. They make money by having money, or they make money off of other people's labor. So they were sort of seen as necessary to society, but not really a creative class. They didn't make things for the state. Soldiers were kind of the same. They were typically uneducated. So this is a big difference from legalism, though, right? Under legalism, soldiers were more highly promoted. They were more expendable. They wouldn't have been anybody unless you became like a general and kind of climbed up. But the average soldier was considered sort of very low in social rank. And then slaves. You'll notice this isn't differentiated by gender or anything like that, but there was kind of a paradoxical role for women during this time. Oh yeah, here's some nice cultural stuff. If this looks familiar to you, this might look like some Ninja Turtle stuff or whatever. This sort of symbolizes some elite life, right? So these are etchings in relief in a tomb. So you can get a sense of like the fancy clothes people were wearing, the fancy sort of things people were doing, artisans and stuff like this. Oh, there you go. There's my roles for women. So during the Han, women play an interesting role. There's some good readings on this. They're both strangely repressed under the Confucian system, but also have a sort of essential role and are sometimes kind of high up in positions of power. In some senses, they have a sort of more spiritually powerful role, but in other times they're excluded from sort of mystical life and like the harmonies and the cosmos and stuff like that. We'll see more with this. Also, I think one of the optional readings is about this too. It can be really tricky. Some of the tombs that we find in Han society are for women who were clearly elite members of society, who had lots of options and were buried with really cool stuff and clearly were not repressed. But for the average woman under the Confucian system, right, there's this hardening of roles where they should be more subservient and things like that. So here's the Silk Road that I was going to show you a little bit earlier. I kind of rearranged this a little bit. So this is straight from like a world history textbook. I'm sure you've been beat over the head with Silk Road before. There's land routes, there's sea routes. But you got to remember, we as historians now call it the Silk Road. At the time, people did not. This was a series of different trails from one place to the other, right? It's not like someone got on the wagon in Luoyang and went all the way to London. Except, as it turns out, maybe they did. But for the most part, that's not how it worked. These people, people in Byzantium wouldn't have known anything about China. Really, they wouldn't have gone that far. This is a series of different connected trade routes that overall, now from our perspective, we look at and say is one thing. But it did allow from the Mediterranean to Japan, essentially, products were exchanged, which is really kind of a crazy system. So here you go to expand a little bit on women under the Han and how that looked. I'll expand on the Silk Road a little bit too for you again in a second. Um, so the primary roles of women under the sort of Confucian system, right, was to stay at home and be subservient to men, work really hard on the farm. So if you were a farmer, it's such a modern the sort of modern concept of domestication and like women working in the home is very much like an American like 1950s on fantasy. If you were a farmer's wife, you worked on the farm all the time, and then you also worked in the home when men didn't want to or when it wasn't convenient for them. So women worked really hard, the vast majority, of the population, with no particular notice of their labor. But that was true for men as well. However, we find a lot of women with incredible power, political power. For example, in the textbook, there's Empress Lu, right? Talks about her. You had nuns, which again is kind of a weird Western translation. There, you could be a Taoist or a sort of shamanistic priestess or a sort of magical person in touch with the powers. These often just get referred to as nuns during this time, but they were educated and they wouldn't have lived with their families. They would live either in temples or as recluses, stuff like that. A lot of elite women were medicinal practitioners. They could own shops. So interestingly, and increasingly, we're going to see this more and more with the Buddhist world as well, because merchants weren't really respected. It was kind of okay for them to be women because they weren't going to be high up in society anyway if you're a merchant. So you don't have to worry about those social norms as much. And we're going to see with Buddhism, this becomes even more of a thing. Also, a lot of women wrote books during this time, which is really funky. For example, Ban Jiao is one quite famous. Her father was a historian. He died. She finished his history, the history of the former Han Dynasty. And she also wrote a side piece called Lessons for Women. And you can read about this. It's one of the optional readings. And she basically urged women to behave in certain ways. If you read it, it's quite interesting because I don't think most women would want to behave in these ways. But the very fact that she was an author who was able to make a successful living as a historian and as a writer and was like giving advice to the multitudes kind of shows that she had some power and respect, which is kind of funky, right? Because she's also telling other women to be, kind of subservient and stuff like this. So the role is very complex. It's not just like, oh, women were repressed or something. Yeah, no kidding, women were repressed. The vast majority of women for almost all of history were repressed. That's not news. What's worth looking for is how women kind of got around the system or the places where that wasn't necessarily true. So you can find these situations where it seems really strange, like women are both being repressed, but then sometimes that creates new little areas for them to be free. We'll see this a lot later with Japan as well. Okay, so back to the Silk Roads a little bit. Again, I know you've probably been beaten over the head with this stuff, but hopefully we can make it a little more interesting, particularly talking just about the Han side. Often when people talk about the Silk Roads, they talk about Rome and the sort of Mediterranean world and how they got stuff from China. But actually, a better way to think of it is there's this trade route that extends across Afro-Eurasia that's focused in China. China was the largest buyer and seller of things. Rome and the Mediterranean world are the sideshow in this event. Yes, Rome is going to grow to be this giant empire, but from the Chinese perspective, they're just one of many customers very, very far away. From the Roman perspective, the goods they got from this sort of Chinese trail were everything, right? Silks and foods and everything else. So really the center, although it doesn't look like it, is China and sort of Central Asia. So these are a series of different routes, right? They go through some incredibly varied terrain. Here's some mountains that are sort of on the edge of the Tibetan steppe, right up against the desert. Here's a desert oasis town. This was one of the many stops, right? So usually if you were a trader, you took short journeys. I trade in jade objects. I load up my donkey and camel cart with jade, and I go about 30 or 40 miles. I travel for a week, and then I sell them to somebody else. And then I go home. People didn't do the whole thing. It's like little segments. So you could stop at these oasis towns. Everyone could meet there. They could exchange products, and then they could go back to the other towns and back, back and through and stuff like that. When you traveled, you relied on caravans to help get you through these areas. Here's another nice section of the Silk Road. This one actually looks quite nice. This is through like Kazakhstan, right? You start with these big mountains, but you also got nice forests. This is a road that still exists. During the time we're looking at, there wouldn't have been a paved road here at all. This is dropping down from the sort of edge of China down into India. So this is a particularly sharp section of the road that dropped down into areas of South Asia to trade there, and then those networks would bring back stuff up to Central Asia. So if you were doing this, you relied on camels. Here you go. Here's these Bactrian camels. If you've seen camels from North Africa, or you think you have a vision of camels, Bactrian camels look pretty different if you don't know them. These are the camels of Central Asia and Northern China. They're hairy, they're squat, they can carry lots of stuff. They can survive in much colder temperatures. Although the deserts in North Africa get cold at night, it's nothing like, Inner Mongolia and Siberia and stuff like that. But these camels survived quite well. And we have a lot of evidence of the Chinese along these roads. One historian, Sima Qian, documented these particular series of travels by a sort of explorer, trader, Zhang Qian. Anyway, he was an envoy sent to the West to sort of figure out who was out there. Not to the West like the Mediterranean, but the West like Central Asia. Because even though on our maps you're like, oh, the Han. Well, to the west of the Han, there were all kinds of other civilizations. There were people with their own writing and economic systems. They weren't Chinese, they weren't Indian, they weren't the Xiongnu, they weren't... they were just totally different societies. And there were lots of them. And normally they just get kind of lumped together as like Central Asians or something like this. But this is where Zhang Qian went. And there's quite an interesting book called Journeys to the West about this. We'll see more sort of stuff based on that in the future. But just like kind of like Marco Polo's story became very famous in Europe, these sorts of stories and documents became famous within the Chinese mind about what's out there to the West. Okay, so quite recently, to mess up the story a little bit, there was an excavation in London. They were building a new path for the tube. They came along an old graveyard from ancient Roman times, when the Romans were up in Britain. So they did an excavation, and they started sequencing the DNA from some of these bones to try and figure out who these people were. And lo and behold, they found some Chinese guys dead, buried in a Roman graveyard in ancient Britain. What were these guys doing there? Who knows? It's really tricky. But they appear to have come from China, obviously. And it's quite possible that they transversed this sort of series of trade routes as far as possible. Through Central Asia, through the Roman world, out to the sort of periphery of the Roman world. it all would have been overland. Certainly there would have been no, boats taking them all this way around or something like that. That's not coming for thousands of years. So it's really strange, and it sort of throws a wrench into the works because for a long time there's really not been much evidence that any individuals would have gone the whole way or something like that until about 1,000 years later. But here we do have evidence, it's pretty unrefutable, that some Chinese people at least were transversing from East Asia to Britain and died there. So it's unclear, were these like traders that permanently resettled that were like the last outpost or something? We don't know. And the research on that is ongoing. So, okay. Another aspect we might try to look at is the sort of unification of the Han. How were they so successful in expanding? By the end of the Han Dynasty, they've created this huge state where lots and lots of people within the empire vaguely feel somehow like they're part of the empire. How do you do that? Well, all of the Han emperors, but particularly Han Wudi, was interested in sort of a process to literally change what people were out there and their relationship to the state. So one thing that he did, and one thing all the emperors did after him, was they would send farmers to settle new areas. If you're an expansive state and you're trying to take over new territory, first of all, if there's no one there farming, you're not getting any tax revenue. But also, if there's no one there, anyone can claim it. So the Han Dynasty sent out farmers and settlers to these areas. Then they encouraged people to marry local women. So the majority of settlers would have been men. You encourage them to marry locals. Why do you do that? Well, because in the whole Confucian system, where the male is seen as better and more authoritative, and the way the family functions is through the male line, when you have children, those children will not be locals anymore, they'll be Han. So if you send enough people out to the hinterland and have them start marrying locals and building businesses and farms, over time, those people will simply become Han. Local people will just disappear. But you can also change the people that are there. One way you can do this is to establish Confucian schools in newly colonized areas. You change the education system. There's local elites. They want their kids to be successful. You tell them that the way to be successful is through Confucianism in these local schools. That's what they're going to do. Also, if you want to participate in government, in economics, in the empire, you have to learn Chinese, both spoken if possible, but written, which is more important. That's how you communicate with the government. There's no phones or anything like that, obviously, right? You're sending letters. If you can read Chinese, you can read the law. You can communicate with those in power. You can communicate with the center of the empire. So these fringe territories start to get educated in Chinese writing and language. At the same time, there's new Han people. They're having kids that are now Han people, right? So it's a way of sort of colonizing and assimilating. There are several direct sort of military engagements as well. Sometimes it doesn't work to just slowly colonize. You might want to send a bunch of troops to go grab specific areas. So there were lots of sort of adventurous military campaigns as well to try to expand the empire. At the very, very height, the Han Empire looked something like this. It's really hard to get an accurate depiction. Whenever you see pre-modern empires, they always have these nice smooth borders. But in reality, that was never the case. The further you go from the center, the more fuzzy borders become, right? It's only as fuzzy, or it's only as strong as you can enforce. So here's one way to look at it. Here's another way to look at it. You have this central sort of core area that's more under direct Han control. Then you have a sort of far out area, the so-called Western regions. These were nominally independent areas that were part of the Silk Road trade, part of Central Asian trade, but they were also part of the Han Empire. To the north, you still have the Xiongnu and lots of different groups going on up there. The Xianbei is worth paying attention to because we're going to see them again later. That's one particular group from up there. So the Han dynasty, the Han Empire, is getting really expansive. This is probably the biggest that you get in sort of the pre-modern world. The next time we're going to see a Chinese dynasty this big isn't until the Qing, like way later, like 18th century. So this is a really, really expansive state. When you have a state this big, particularly before industrialization and all kinds of modern communication, there's all kinds of pockets where they don't really have control and all that sort of stuff. But again, when you make maps, it's all smoothed out, right? But nevertheless, a huge expansive state. Part of the reason the Han state was so large and so successful was the sort of level of economic control they had originally and the way they were able to standardize the economy. So right up until the 19th century in world history, China is the largest, most economically successful state in the world. And that's just always true. The economy there is just huge. Part of that has to do with population, but there's a lot of things going on. So one of the things that the Han did very successfully, building on the Qin, was they standardized all the currency. So wherever you went within the empire, you could pay for things, you knew what things cost, and it enabled all kinds of sort of free market activities, what we would call it now. Obviously, they didn't call it anything like that. At the same time, the government itself had a sort of monopolies on a number of products. So salt mining or drying at the ocean, iron production, coin production, the production of alcohol, maybe silk, although it's a little bit tricky because lots of people just made silk in their homes. Same thing with alcohol. The government could regulate these industries, and they were becoming industries, to the extent that the government managed where salt was produced, what it cost, where it was distributed. The same with iron smelting and all these sorts of things. So with the government being in control of particular sort of sectors of the economy, again, this is like very modern way of talking about these things. They could control taxation, they could control what areas developed more quickly, they could control the sort of economic growth. On the flip side, even though they had all that economic success, their bills were getting really high. All of that expansion came at a cost. You had to have giant militaries, and the more you pushed on the Xiongnu, the more they pushed back. To the south, things were pretty good. The Han didn't try to go too far into Vietnam, and so it was okay. But in the north, they met tons of people that were used to living there, that were warriors, that had excellent horse riding skills, that were fast. So you needed to field really big armies to get up there. That's expensive. So when you need to field really big armies, what do? Well, you tax people more. But if you remember, when the Han dynasty formed, one of the first things they did was they lowered taxes. So now they're going to increase them. Also, if you're going to go on a bunch of expensive sort of military expeditions, you might start doing stuff that people don't like taking their property. If you're trying to expand the state and local aristocrats or notables or generals have property in those areas, you have to take it. If you do that too much, people don't like it. As part of this process, you see a rise in the number of slaves and the number of tenant farmers. So tenant farmers aren't a good thing. Here's some merchants, by the way. These aren't tenant farmers. But the reason that you don't want so many tenant farmers is tenant farmers, right, are people who pay rent in kind. They pay a portion of their grain to own the property. Just like with houses or anything else, property you own, you're going to value more. you're going to take better care of it. When you rent an apartment, you don't treat it like the house you own. And the same is true for farming. If you own the land, and you get all of the profit off of that land, you are more incentivized to work hard in a way and to ensure the property increases in value and all that sort of stuff. When you're just renting land so that you can make grain, so that you can feed your kids, you might be less incentivized to sort of grow the society as a whole, right? At least that's the idea. Along with this, you get lots of banditry and rebellion. When the taxes get too high, you start to get Robin Hood type figures. When the farmers aren't getting paid enough or they don't own their land, you start to get rebellions. So the Han have this great economic success, but then they push on it too much and it starts to kind of flip on them a little bit. Here's some nice peasant rebellions, right? So all of these factors kind of coming together, this sort of overextension helps bring the government down. The central government is going to kind of disintegrate. You get this sort of factionalism, this sort of problem after hundreds of years, right? I mean, it takes a really long time. But you have different family members, you have eunuchs again, you have Confucian scholars, you have different lines of the sort of imperial family. They're all vying for who's going to be in power. At the same time, you have one particular strong rebellion, this Yellow Turban Peasant Rebellion is what it's called. Basically, you have groups of peasants in one particular area that wear yellow wrappings right on their heads, so they get identified that way. This is in the late 2nd century. So out of this, chaos starts to emerge, and there's a guy, Cao Cao, who's a general. He betrays the empire, and he basically snatches the last Han emperor who's a kid and ransoms him, and it just like blows up the whole situation. And when it does, there you go, there's Cao Cao. When it does, things break apart and you get these 3 big kingdoms instead, Wei, Shu, and Wu, and here they are represented as people from those areas in a sort of classic Chinese depiction. So the Han dynasty breaks apart, and when it does, the Han Empire becomes 3 separate regions in that sort of like concentrated main area of China, and all those frontier areas are kind of left on their own. So this is often referred to as the 3 Kingdoms period, because you have 3 kingdoms side by side, Wei, Shu, and Wu. But you'll notice that like all those kind of far out areas are just kind of gone for now. So later, in once things cool down, there's going to be a book written called The Romance of the 3 Kingdoms. It's going to become the most popular novel in China. Everybody's going to read it when they get educated. It's a very common thing for people to read because it's filled with like all the exploits that went on during this 3 Kingdoms period, but it's retold in like a really romantic fashion. There's battles and love stories and grand strategy and all this sort of stuff. Really, it was kind of a crazy time. The Han broke apart. You have 3 generals that kind of grab power, carve off their own little areas, and start immediately kind of fighting each other. In the sort of broader social sense, for the average peasant, not much changes, right? If you're a rice farmer in the middle of nowhere, you're still a rice farmer in the middle of nowhere. But for the elite, this causes a whole sort of series of cultural problems. Remember, Confucianism is really propagated during the Han. So the whole sort of top layer of society is like steeped in Confucian tradition. And this idea is about meritocracy and all these sorts of things. Propriety, ritual, that sort of idea of benevolence and all that stuff. Also, what about the mandate of heaven? Okay, so the Han ended. Where's your new leader to take up this mantle, right? If you have 3 different kingdoms that are all fighting, it doesn't really make sense. So, oh yeah, here you go. Here's the 3 kingdoms, the Romance of the 3 Kingdoms. So for a brief period, you get this sort of chaotic turn against Confucianism by these scholars. So there's lots of people, they know how to write, they know how to read, they write poetry, they've read all these classics. They thought they were going to grow up to be a government official or a judge or a tax collector or something like this. But now the empire's fallen apart. What do you do? Well, a lot of them got into this thing, mysterious learnings, and they started to do things like drink a bunch of wine and get together in the woods and talk about philosophy and all kinds of things that seemed kind of decadent. It's kind of associated with Taoism, and it's a more sort of magical and spiritual time. Maybe instead of trying to work for the government, you need to work on yourself. Maybe you should try to understand heaven itself rather than some particular government. All kinds of interesting ideas. This is when you get this sort of era of like sages that wander off into the woods with wine on their own and like play music and have all this funky stuff going on. This sort of dark learning or sort of learning outside the context of Confucianism. It's a really ideological thing. The book does a good job talking about it a little bit. We'll see this tradition kind of continue later. So this period is really funky. It's going to call the whole idea of like continued dynasties in China into question. From the 3rd to the 7th century, now we're in CE, there's 37 different dynasties in China, many at the same time. Also, at least 22 of those dynasties are ruled by non-Chinese people, people that the Chinese considered barbarians or outsiders or something like that, but they were the ones running the country. So there's a really weird, chaotic period going on, and we're going to look at all that next time. So during this period, the sort of age of classics, the Qin, the Han, Confucianism really develops. It's when you get the whole basis for the classics, when you get the basis for a Chinese state, and the sort of core ideology of all subsequent Chinese sort of philosophies and ways of thinking about governance. Also, the unification of the empire became a thing. You had this idea by the end of the Han that there could be some massive empire stretching, across the world until it fell apart. So next time we're going to look at what happens when it falls apart. Is it just this era of chaos, or is it kind of like a cosmopolitan age? We'll also talk a little bit more about Japan. We'll sort of get into that side as well. What were they doing during all this sort of time period? I know this is long. Thanks for sticking with it. If you have any questions, go ahead and email me, and I look forward to all the discussions.